how did you get into politics?
I think I always had this idea that it was an interesting way to try and solve problems.
What are the top 3 issues that you're addressing or fixing?
I think it needs to be faster, more affordable, and easier to build in this country.
So how do we stimulate innovation in the building sector?
I think from a government point of view, what we want to do is be more enabling, be a bit more liberal.
How's the government using AI?
Now, obviously, there's, this will sound really edgy to a lot of people.
People leaving the country to go to Australia. What are your thoughts on how we address that?
And I think it'll be a really interesting discussion across New Zealand and with all the different political parties.
If you were Prime Minister for a year, what would you do in your first 100 days?
Yeah, I should be careful how I phrase it.
Hey, Marti Amos, founder of The Professional Builder. Today we're here at Parliament to interview Chris Penk, the Minister for Building and Construction, and we're going to put the hard questions to him on how do we improve the economy, how do we make the building sector more productive and more profitable for small building company owners in New Zealand. All right, so today we've got a special episode of the Builders Ladder. We're at the Beehive in Wellington, Parliament, and we're here with Chris Penk, MP for Building and Construction. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much, Marty. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Great to have you here again. And I think we caught up in Nelson when we were doing a tour of New Zealand. And I just want to get your background. How did you get into politics and what attracted it, to you?
Yeah, I'm interested in politics, obviously now, but from a long way back, I think I always had this idea that it was an interesting way to try and solve problems. Before politics, I was in the Navy for a while and then in law. And when you're a lawyer, you have to work with one client at a time, interpreting the law as it is. You don't get a chance to change it. You just got to sort of work with it as best you can. But it did seem to me that it's an opportunity in politics to actually change the rules of the game, hopefully not to be able to help just one client at one time, but actually have a much broader effect across New Zealand. So, people would make their own judgment how successful, I am or anyone is in politics, but at least in theory, that's the possibility.
Awesome. When we were in the Navy, and what attracted you to the Navy, and how do you go from Navy to law?
Yeah, I was in the year 2000 to 2008, but I split my time across those 8 years roughly equally between New Zealand Navy and Australian Navy. So I joined the New Zealand Navy, as you do, Auckland kid, went along to the North Shore, and then after a few years on, among other things, an Anzac class frigate here, Te Kaha, I went to Australia to join the submarine squadron. And for me, it was about finishing my time in Australia, coming back home, and I'd started a law degree before that. So it was really unfinished business to complete that. Didn't know I wanted to practice law. Truth be told, I didn't. But I thought, well, I'll do that. And then it seemed like a good idea at the time. As they say, all best decisions are made with that mind frame. And after that, it just seemed to me, as I say, that if you go into politics, you can change the law as opposed to just applying it. So that was the kind of evolution in my mind.
Gotcha. Awesome. So how do you split your time if you're from Auckland? Do you spend half your time in Wellington and half traveling around New Zealand, or how do you balance time with family and work?
It's definitely a juggle. So the answer to how I juggle it is with difficulty. But it's a balance where you say at the starting point, from a work point of view, you're actually elected as an MP for a particular area before you're a minister. So those responsibilities really come first. I always call it my day job. So my case, it's an area called Kaipuraki Maharangi. Roughly speaking, it's northwest in the rural north of Auckland. So I've spent as much time as there as possible. Those are the people who voted me in. They deserve representation from their local MP. But having said that, I spend too much time here for my liking in Wellington. Obviously, Parliament sits, and it's about 30 weeks a year. So more often than not, in a given week, we're here for some of the time. And then around the country, like you say, we bumped into each other in Nelson. I think I was just flying in and out for the day in that occasion.
So what are the top 3 issues that you see in the construction sector in New Zealand, and what is your remit? Or first we'll start, what is your remit as Minister for Building and Construction? And then what are the top 3 issues that you see that you're addressing or fixing?
Yeah, I think it needs to be faster, more affordable, and easier to build in this country. So obviously the reverse of those, in terms of being costly, slow, and inefficient, those are the problems. And the remit is to solve those by thinking about how we can make it easier at every step of the way. in terms of the people doing the work, the products and the processes. And I always use those 3 Ps. It just clarifies things in my mind. And I often speak at conferences or events where people ask what the agenda is. And there are a lot of individual things that we've done, and you can get into the weeds of those really quickly. And perhaps we will talk about some of that detail, but I think you've got to maintain the overall picture. What are you trying to do? Easier, faster, and therefore more affordable without sacrificing the quality, the sustainability, the safety. And I think if you take a balanced approach and try and, bear in mind all those considerations, you can actually get to a better result without sort of sacrificing one of those things for the other.
100%. Which countries do you look to that have the best aspects of their regulatory structure for governance of building and construction? So, because Australia has quite a different setup and a lot more onerous in some ways with regards to what building company owners can, how much they're allowed to build. So they'll have caps on, 4.5, 7 million, etc. And they have to show that they have the right fiduciary responsibilities in place, that they have the balance sheet isn't too leveraged, that they don't go down the drain, overextend themselves, etc. Yeah. Do you see any, are you looking to bring in anything like that into New Zealand?
Yeah, I think elements of the Australian experience are really helpful. And in some of those, we are frankly copying their homework. If you think about the liability question for example, whereas in New Zealand at the moment, we've got the joint and several liability as that now, but we said we're going to change. That our councils have huge responsibility and liability up to the 100% the cost of fixing a defect. And obviously in this country, we've had a particular history of leaky buildings, but then again, that's not unique to New Zealand either. In different Australian jurisdictions, and of course they've got a state-by-state basis, so it's slightly different. But, there's these elements of the Australian experience we can copy, and it's not to say they get things perfect there. And, we've obviously also got to think, what suits New Zealand conditions best. We've got huge variation in Northland and South, compared with Southland and everywhere in between. So we're our own special case in a way, but I think there's much that we can learn from. And certainly at the level of, for example, product approvals, when we reinvent the wheel on every time, I'm talking about the products themselves and the standards, but also in terms of the way we make decisions. I think there's a lot that we can learn from other countries and not be too precious about having a uniquely Kiwi way where the laws of physics are not different in this country and the rest of the world.
100%. I think the easiest or fastest way to achieve success is to have a look at a model or a recipe or a playbook of someone who's achieved what you want to achieve, whether it's regulatory reform or how to bake a cake or how to get in shape. Follow their system, follow their process, use their ingredients, and you'll get a very similar outcome. I'm glad you brought up leaky building because I've had, I think, 3 of them now. And the latest one, we've been fixing our garage, which has a flat pitch roof, which in my mind should be illegal, internal gutters, which a lot of other countries have outlawed, and box gutters as well, which are like a throwback to the 90s and, get overfilled with rain and so forth. What is the government doing to address the leaky building issue in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of it just sounds to me like flat out bad design. And I hope that 100% hope we don't go back in terms of, the features that you've described, which sound to me now, and it's easy to be wise in hindsight. And I'm not a technical guy. I'm not a designer by profession. I'm not going to pretend to be knowledgeable on these things, but it does sound like a lot of bad decisions were made at an individual building level, but also in terms of how the profession sort of understood things. I mean, we just simply wouldn't make mistakes like that in the mid 2020s that we were collectively making in the 90s. Now, that's not to be complacent and say that we've reached the end of history and there'll never be bad designs brought forward again. But from a system perspective, the answer is actually to be more mindful of where the responsibility should lie. And I know that sounds like a bit of a counterintuitive point when we say, well, we don't want councils to be 100% liable for the cost when you could have an architect or an LBP design or other key players in the system, might be engineers, might be building surveyors. If you have them on the hook to be responsible for the decisions that they make, then they will be more careful, not less, because it will come home to them if there is a mistake. So I think if we put the responsibility and the incentives where they should rightly lie, then all you're left is the question whether the vulnerable consumer, the homeowner, is going to be left holding the baby in the event that there's a cock-up. And that's why we've announced recently that there needs to be professional indemnity insurance for those categories of key player that I've just mentioned, so that if there's such an event in the future, well, number one, there shouldn't be it would be less likely. I'll say not never, but less likely that there is one. And people who design poorly and have a bad track record simply won't be able to get the insurance. They won't be able to do their work.
Because you could almost reverse engineer the solution based off AI by looking at what have all the leaky building claims been, and then what are the commonalities from design, materials, building, council, etc., and then reverse engineer these are the top 3, and then go through and systematically solve those. So how's the government we use AI heavily in our business to get best practice, better results for our building company owners. How's the government using AI like to address the leaky building, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI can be helpful to analyze the mistakes of the past. When, as you say, you can do that analysis to understand where the common areas of failure have been. But I'm really excited as well that AI can be used in a consenting environment to basically assess applications. Now, obviously, there's, this will sound really edgy to a lot of people, and we're used to having old mate from the council turn up with a clipboard, like a physical, literal thing, and go and, tap on this or look behind that. So it will be a bit revolutionary for people. But I'm also wary that if we try and amend the building code in 2025 that takes into account exactly how things should be done in terms of AI or machine learning, we won't nail it. But if we do, even then, in the following years that, come ahead, it'll immediately be out of date. Of course, this area is evolving so fast. So I think the better approach is to be enabling of people to use those tools. And if you say, well, if you want to back yourself and you can get the insurance or whatever, the assurance in place, or you simply want to take the risk as someone who's going to continue to own a property and not pass it on to someone who's going to, have to wear the consequences of a defect, then actually, get the benefit of that innovation, go ahead and use it. And, that's where we'll get the innovation, the better practices and the better productivity going forward.
Yeah, 100%. So you brought up a good topic then, innovation. So how do we stimulate innovation in New Zealand in the building sector? Because there's a lot of other overseas, there's a lot of innovation like the Callahan Centre. There's a lot of innovation in other practices, medical, finance, etc. But construction seems to lag behind massively. How do we look for best practice, like with, for example, energy efficient buildings, green building, bringing in overseas building practices, tilt panels, etc., to have better productivity and better execution and affordability? Yeah.
Well, I think the market will naturally wish to have better solutions than is currently available, and it might be in terms of sustainability, as you've quite rightly mentioned, and even then you break that down to the motivations around a healthy living environment, the cost of energy, and so on. But if you think about the market wanting to make those choices and needing the innovation to enable it, I think from a government point of view, what we want to do is be more enabling, be a bit more liberal, but of course, again, without, wanting to lower the guardrails to the point we end up with large scale failures. Partly, we don't want individual buildings or a particular system-wide failure, but I'm also really mindful to try and be quite measured in the approach we bring, because what we don't want is to have a failure that people then freak out and go, well, look, we need to be totally back to how we were, in a way that's really risk averse. Totally natural, of course, for people to think about that in the context of leaky buildings, but innovation should mean that we go, well, there's a whole wide world of different products and practices that are available out there. Let people make decisions that work for them, take away the impediments to doing that. And if they want to make those choices as a market, then inevitably we'll end up with a better productivity rate than, for example, where we are now, 1984, before the internet, before the economy of scale with 5 million people in this country instead of, 2 or 3 million. So, there's a lot of possibilities, I think, if we just enable people to get on and make those choices.
Yeah, 100%. So you've announced the biggest shake-up in the building consent system in 2 decades. What were you hearing from builders, councils and homeowners that made you want to make these reforms? Like, one of them is going from joint and several liability to the proportionate model. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in terms of what I was hearing from people, sometimes people do speak the language of liability or a system change, but more often they will say, Chris, I've got a problem because it's taking me ages to get this across the line with my local council. Or, they gave me an RFI in terms of a thing that the council next door told me that they were happy with. I mean, and then when you start to put all that together, and when you travel around the country and hear enough of these anecdotes, it forms an overall view that you go, well, obviously something's broken. And then and you think about how you can solve that at a system level, as opposed to going and knocking down the council door of, whoever and saying here's a specific individual problem. I mean, I don't get to intervene at that level anyway, and it wouldn't be helpful if I did. But if you say, well, you add all those things together, and then you talk to both sides of the equation, talk to the councils, and they say,
you want to find out what's slowing them down. Why are they so slow and inefficient and so much red tape and bureaucracy?
That's right. And I mean, I take them at their word when they say, well, we're really fearful on behalf of our ratepayers that we've got all this risk associated with saying yes. It's just easier to say no. There's no consequence if they don't, because they're a monopoly. They've got a hell of a responsibility because they've got to administer the building code and the building act that's set by this building. And, in some cases, the smaller ones have relatively few resources. They actually want to share the resources oftentimes across their boundaries. So to be enabling of that, we think is going to be helpful,
right? Both
for them, but again, for the builders who are working in a region and shouldn't be looking at a line on a map to see which council they're going to deal with to consent the same thing today that they did yesterday with no problems next door. In terms of liability, therefore, all you're saying is really responsibility goes with the key players in the system who are doing the work. And it might be, obviously, it's a design level and engineering, but then it's also the builders and other tradies who are implementing. And of course, council's got to be responsible to some extent. They approve a consent, they conduct inspections, and then obviously a CCC out the other end.
So what will that look like from a pragmatic, practical level for builders to feel an improvement in consents? And
I mean, it's hard to know how quickly that change will come. I think for two reasons. One is we've got to pass a law to make that so. And this place, the wheels do grind slowly because you've got to get the legislation drafted and go through all those democratic processes. And of course, you want to take the time to get it right by listening to people. I don't want to wave a magic wand in a way that makes sense to me sitting in this building that doesn't help in the real world.
So how do you actually get a law passed here? So, for example, council?
Well, there's quite the process, but I mean, if you depends how far back you want to go, but roughly speaking, let's say there are a lot of conversations that lead to an idea that it needs to be changed.
Do you submit an RFP and then?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, we talk about cabinet papers. So cabinet being, the government making decisions. So I would basically make a proposal. As the minister, here's the thing that I think we need to do. Other ministers will agree or disagree. And by the way, I'm shortcutting a whole heap of process there, but just for argument's sake, the government agrees. Usually then we'd announce it and talk about that with, key players in the industry, general public. But then in terms of actually passing the law, it's got to get drafted or drawn up or written up into legislation that then passes through Parliament, 3 different readings or stages. But a key point, and for any of your listeners or your viewers who want to be involved in the process, a select committee, a group of MPs who are tasked specifically at looking at that law, will hear submissions from the public about whether we've got it right, whether we've got it wrong, just details that we might have missed or things that are important to them. So the more participation at that stage, the better product we get when it passes its 3rd and final reading or stage.
Does it get put to a vote at the end, or how does it actually pass into law?
Well, it gets voted on in Parliament, and it's all the political parties, MPs, so there's 120 something these days. And so it's not just the government of the day, it's the whole Parliament. Because the government controls the whole Parliament, we know if we decide as government with the current 3 parties that we agree with the ministers and cabinet, then it will pass in Parliament. So we know it's going to happen at that point. But we've got the opportunity along the way to talk with the other parties, so the opposition now. And I'm really keen on doing that. And I will just say for the record, I've had good engagement, and I'm really pleased that we've had those other parties engaging constructively.
And do the coalition partners typically vote with you, and unless it's one of their flagship policies that runs counter to national?
We don't get to a point where we put laws forward that they would vote against.
Right.
Some pretty robust discussions and decision making in the cabinet room, but we're not allowed to disclose that. We have to sort of keep that in house. But actually, can I just say, and the risk of being political, the good news is the current government, we're all very much on the same page. Or you approach it from the point of view of national believing very much in markets making good decisions better than bureaucrats or dare I say politicians. Present company included, and then ACT have got very much a freedom focus. New Zealand First have got particular impetus around granny flats up north where a lot of their people live and have just suffered under years of not being able to build affordably in regions that frankly have suffered as a consequence. So we're all on the same page, and actually the opposition parties have been pretty good too. They've come along for the ride, and my thing is, if we can get all the parties voting in favour of legislation, then no one in the general public, or the trades especially, is going to be worried that if there's a change of government, things are going to be upended, and we're going to end up with a constant cycle of change.
With the previous communist government that we had a couple of terms ago, they put forward a Muldoon type think big Kiwi build project, which was a massive cluster on almost every facet. Does your government have any bigger type projects or stimuli to accelerate, the economy and the building sector?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because from our point of view, the sector does need to be stimulated. We do need a lot of activity because, obviously the traditional boom bust cycle isn't healthy. But having said that, we'd rather be closer to the boom than the bust than we've been in the last several years.
Yep.
Some of it's the natural consequence of decisions that were made, let's just say for shorthand in good faith following a pandemic. And we can, we could relitigate that, and a whole podcast could be thrashing that out. But
it'd be good if they showed up to the, showed up to the inquiry and actually fronted.
Naturally, I agree, but I assume you don't want me to go too far down that rabbit hole. So I will just say, as at now, we need some stimulation. But from the point of view of the current government being of a more centre-right persuasion, stimulation is the market saying there are opportunities here, and you're not going to get in our way unnecessarily with planning laws. So that's the work that Chris Bishop is leading around, resource management, the area plan and unity plan, all of that. Yeah, just to be much more enabling, and that's the stimulation in conjunction with the real world stuff around interest rates and the slowly improving economy. So that's our stimulation, as opposed to say, well, let's build 100,000 government homes. We know how that ended in Kiwi build, but even just philosophically, we don't think it's the right approach.
No, do I. So there's a lot of macro factors that are trending in the right direction. So inflation, interest rates, employment. There's one that's trending in the wrong direction, and that's the brain drain and people leaving the country to go to Australia and so forth. What are your thoughts on how we address that?
Yeah, we can bring it back, and in time that will be the case. I'm really confident. We've seen over the years, with the previous few governments, in the time of I don't want to be overly political, it's just stating fact in terms of the outflow of New Zealanders under the government that was before John Key's national government came in 2008. Big net outflow of New Zealanders to Australia. In the end, that got reversed, but it can't be reversed because we, stop people at the border.
100%.
Piece of thought. No. But actually, we've got to have an attractive place for people to want to remain in, and that means getting the basics right. And I know it's not as sexy as anything that the government could say that's directly stimulatory. If you say we're going to build 100,000 homes, actually 100 homes. I misspoke, but actually that was closer to the truth as it turned out. Actually, what I actually achieved.
Yeah.
But, you can have government policies that are rinky-dink to try and have people stay here, but it'll only ever be a short-term basis if we don't fix the fundamentals in this country of why we're not as wealthy as Australia, and our nurses and our doctors, and our police officers and our defence force don't get as well paid because we're not as wealthy a nation. We can fix that, and we're trying to, and the productivity is part of it. Building and construction's one bit, but it's one of many different things we need to fix that we'll try and fix all at once.
100%. So on that, employment laws. So we've grown very quickly this year. So when we began, the Professional Builder began the beginning of the year in January, we had 32 people on our team. We've currently got almost 100. Now, not all of those are going to be A-grade players. And sometimes it takes longer than 90 days because you want to give them the opportunity to shine and train, and you need to either coach people up or coach people out. With a contractor, so we can employ people overseas. We're an online business and we're an in-person business doing seminars and so forth. We can employ contractors, which are much easier to, decide mutually, this is not a good fit, it's not working, hey, here's what we need to see in terms of your results. What are your thoughts on improving the onerous and draconian, in my opinion, employment laws that we have, particularly around the 90-day, because it seems crazy that me as a small business owner, an employee can come to me and say, hey, it's not really working. Hey, I found a better job or I'm off. Here's my 30-day notice.
Yeah.
But we can't do that as if this person isn't a good fit or they're not performing well. And even worse, if we try and have that conversation after the 90 days, it's either we need to either go down one of two paths. We need to either go down the punitive / performance improvement process, etc., or we go down the restructure path. But you can't do one or the other, because if you have a conversation with them and then you decide to go down, hey, look, your performance isn't where it's at, you decide to go down the restructure path, then it's a sham redundancy and you end up with a PG. And half the time you do end up with a PG, even though you're trying to do the best thing by both the team, because the business has to come first. You have to uphold high standards. So I would love to know, how do we address that? Because it's making it literally like I think we've probably made 5 to 10 people redundant this year because they're not away players. And it hurts the business if we keep them on the team, and they might be a better fit somewhere else.
Yeah.
So how do we address that, and what are your thoughts on it? Because it's making it that we don't want to employ employees in New Zealand anymore. We will either employ people as contractors, and technically they're not the contractor because of those 5 key litmus tests.
Yes.
Or we'll look to, like, we can have a videographer here in New Zealand, but we don't want an employee. Brendan's a Kiwi living in Vancouver and has a offshore team that do all our video editing and everything. But we're not employing Kiwis to do that because of, even though they're very attractive from a Kiwi peso perspective. So what? Because I must not be the only the only business owner that feels like that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, this comes up a lot, to be honest. I should be careful how I phrase it, because I'm not the relevant minister for workplace relations. But I will say, depending on when you're listening to this or watching this, we're going into an election year, and I think it'll be a really interesting discussion across New Zealand and with all the different political parties, because small business, I know it's a cliche, but it is, the backbone of our economy. It's 97% of our businesses in this country are small, fewer than 20 FTEs. And within that, a huge proportion, I think about 70 is sole traders. And so if you think about all the contracting arrangements, for me, the starting point is why would people want to have a contracting arrangement? And there's different reasons for that. And sometimes it's perfectly healthy and respectable. But sometimes if you go, well, actually, if a business just doesn't want the risk of have someone on their books as an employee, as I think you've alluded to, then maybe we haven't got the settings right. And we just make it hard for people to take on a young Kiwi or maybe a mid-career person. And that's the last thing we want, is to give you that nervousness that you don't want to take someone on, because actually best for all concerned is actually you do take a punt on someone. They might turn out to be great. But of course, if they're not, then, you would reluctantly have to let them go. But if your incentives are actually the same as the person you're taking on, then why would we make it hard for you to take them on with that fear of the PG in the background? So I would be really keen, again, choosing my words carefully, that going into election year, there's a good conversation about whether small businesses particularly can be relieved of some of those burdens of the, the way the Employment Relations Act makes it really difficult to take people on. You're probably reading between the lines that I'm sort of quite keen to be helpful in the space.
Here's a great way to answer that via third-party projecting. Are there any other overseas countries that have great labour laws or employment policies that you think would be worth us looking at and modelling?
Yeah, I probably don't know the whole landscape well enough to say that this one over here is better and this one is not.
The US is one that springs to mind.
I mean, I don't know that we've got the appetite in this country overall to be as flexible in our arrangements as the US, but I do know that I think there are opportunities for us to have small business owners less fearful that they're going to end up with a PG despite their best efforts. And, I've seen it from a legal side, on both sides of the equation, by the way. The employer or the employee, basically has a situation where things haven't worked out. Everyone knows it, but you still got to go through the sham of restructuring. And that's kind of crazy in itself, because it's time and energy. You've got an inefficient or non-productive person on your books who, by the way, might be great doing some other job or might not. Ultimately, that shouldn't be your problem. And it's just, a dead weight in terms of the economy. And I think everyone's unhappy through the process. So why on earth we can't have a more liberal regime? And I'm not saying 90 days necessarily gets extended out into the never never, but, you think about the possibility for...
There will be a simple not really Band-Aid solution, but if you extended the 90 for another 90 and there were certain parameters that had to be met on both sides, so X, Y, and Z had happened in terms of onboarding, training, review, monthly review. Like you could put some protocols in place that made that a necessity or something that is available to both sides. Yeah. And be like, cool. Well, it'll be way more productive.
That's certainly very good feedback. We'll take that on board.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so if you were Prime Minister for a day or Prime Minister for a year, what would you do in your first 100 days? So like private equity have their 100-day plan.
Yeah, sure.
Presume the government has a very similar process.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, we have a 100-day plan that we come in and do immediately. We come in, and just for the record, very happy to be under Prime Minister Christopher Luxon. But I'm pretty sure that if we are successful in the next election, then the 100-day plan will include a lot of things that are needed just to basically make life easier in this country for Kiwi businesses and everyone else, just trying to live their lives in a way that's as free from government interference as possible.
Awesome. And my last question, Chris, if everything goes the way that you intend and New Zealand's construction sector is successful, what does that look like 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think we've got a high but steady, sustainable level of consenting activity and of course, building activity. And we use consent for shorthands because it's measurable. But obviously, we want the actual activity. We've got a well-skilled workforce, and I think those two are connected. I think we need to see in this country that there are good prospects for people to get into the trades, remain in them. In this country, by the way, too many Warriors jerseys and All Blacks jerseys on building sites in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and so on. So I think if people see that there are good prospects because there's a good pipeline of work, and some of it, by the way, is government infrastructure projects, probably more at the infrastructure end and the residential build or even commercial, but a bit of both, a bit of everything. But most importantly, the market can see there's good opportunities. There's a reason for them to stick around. They'll be productive because we're going to remove a lot of the barriers that are just getting in the way without adding any value in terms of quality, sustainability, safety. And if we do that, people will see good prospects. They'll want to be here. They'll want to be in the game. And that'll be, of course, a win for Kiwi consumers who'll be able to actually afford to live in a home in this country. So really hopeful that we're sort of moving in the right direction with that. Won't happen overnight, but in the medium to long term, I think our prospects are really good in that space.
Awesome. All right, I appreciate you. Thank you very much for your time today, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure for my point of view. Thanks so much.
Cheers. Appreciate it. Thank you.